Hi everyone, and welcome to our QCE Business exam revision lecture for the ATAR Notes September lecture series. My name is Jess. So before I introduce myself a little bit more, let's have a little overview of ATAR Notes for any of you who aren't familiar with us. So we started back in about 2007, and since then have been offering lots of different resources for high school students. And the lecture series have been going since 2015, and they are just part of our commitment to helping students with lots of free resources. And if you're unaware of the other resources that we have available, here are some examples. So we've also got discussions, online Q&As, so videos, articles, ATAR calculators, and newsletters as well, and study notes, which I highly recommend. So all of that's available on our website if you are interested. And a little bit more about me. So my name is Jess. I graduated in 2020 and I'm currently studying communication and journalism at the University of Queensland. I'm in my third year of that dual degree. And in Year 12 Business, I got a score of 95. And I love reading and writing, so all of the humanities subjects were my favourite, and English as well. Okay, so in terms of what we're covering today, to start with, we're looking at the content that you need to know. So you'll need to know a whole bunch of things in terms of being able to describe things and explain things, and that is the focus for the first section of today's session. Then we will look at the models that you'll need to know, Lewin's change model and Kotter's 8-step model. Then we'll go to analytical tools. So some of these you may already be familiar with, like our SWOT analysis, and some of them may be a little bit newer. Then we'll look at evaluation criteria. We've got those 4 evaluation criteria that you need to know, and you will have hopefully done already throughout year 12 and year 11, and we'll finish off with some practice questions and some tips as well. Okay, let's get started. So this unit is all about change management. We've gone through the different phases of the business life cycle, and we're now up to this post-maturity stage. So the process of managing a business's transition from its current state to a desired future state. That is the basis of change management. It is a broad expression, so keep that in mind. It's not specific, so when we say change management, it can mean some different things. And it's a strategic, structured approach that aims to enhance a company's performance and maintain its competitiveness. So that change from the current state to the desired future state is for a purpose. There's some kind of reason that needs to happen, and generally it's going to be because the business needs to renew itself in some way to maintain that competitiveness in what has become most likely a saturated kind of market with lots of competition. So a really key part that you need to be able to do in business is describe business facts and characteristics in terms of internal operating and macro environmental factors. So you really need to understand these 3 levels of the different factors that have a role in business. And in this unit that you'll be doing for your external exam, it is about business renewal. So these facts and characteristics will relate to business renewal, and they will be the factors that influence the need for change. Why does the business need to change in order to remain strong in the industry? So we've got some examples here. We can start with internal. So think of this as like a building or a house of some sort. Your owners, your managers, your employees are all on the inside, and so is the structure of the building and the culture within that environment. It's all internal in the business, all inside that building. Operating is those things that are going to impact the way that it functions. So they're not inside the business as such, but it directly impacts operations. Customers, competitors, suppliers, and interest groups just refers to any other parties that are going to be affecting that operating side of things, who are stakeholders that are interested somehow. And macro, we can remember that using that STEEPLE acronym. You will have done a STEEPLE analysis before: sociocultural, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. And those are those outside factors that impact the business. So macro that means sort of the bigger. You have micro, which is the smaller, and macro is more all-encompassing. So you can see that macro falls on the outside of our diagram there, because it is those outside kind of forces. So if we have a look at some examples of some of these, we've got Dreamworld. So it's internal and employees in this case. The environmental factor influencing the need for change was employees, because we had the Thunder River Rapids ride accident back in 2016, and employees, as a result of that accident, put pressure on the company to provide training, so they had the knowledge and skills to operate the rides safely, to avoid those sorts of incidents in future. So that's an example of someone inside the organization putting pressure on the organization to make a change. And that was also relating to business renewal, because Dreamworld really suffered as a result of that incident in terms of their reputation and their sort of record in the public eye. So that they needed to change, and the employees were directly behind that. And keep in mind that we will see with these examples, and you will see with everything that you do in business, that these are all overlapping. So while this example we've spoken about employees, there are other things that you could relate this to as well. So maybe you could say the organizational culture was pushing that need for change, because they didn't have that strong culture of having the training, having the sort of trust in the systems and things like that. You could also relate it to things like legal. So they may have been actually required by law to make some changes because of the practices not being up to standard, for example. So definitely very interrelated, but you can see how some are more relevant than others for different types of examples too. We've got Coca-Cola as an example of operating for customers. So customers impacted the need for change, because they have some changing demands around things like the different sugar content that drinks have, the packaging and the sustainability of packaging, and also just diverse tastes of different people as well. So these sorts of factors, these consumer kind of demands, have impacted Coca-Cola's change over time, because they've had to cater to those diverse tastes, introduce products that are healthier, so the different sort of zero sugar options and things like that. And also it's resulted in Coca-Cola making packaging recyclable as well. So you can see again here how this intersects with other aspects of our diagram. You are talking about customers and how they are impacting the need for change, but it also relates to the environmental macro factor and the sociocultural environment macro factor, because that's about culture and people and the demands of people. So definitely overlapping in lots of ways. Another operating example for competitors, we've got Esprit, which is in that retail industry, and the competitors drive the need for change because it was a saturated market. They weren't making enough revenue. They had falling revenues in their Australian market. So their strategy was to change operations to concentrate their efforts in the Asian market instead. So sometimes competitors can drive change in terms of driving you out of a sector entirely. Other times you may be needing to use other strategies like introducing new products, changing opening hours, having some kind of research and development and innovation to get ahead of competitors by investing in those new kind of technologies as well. Lego, a macro environmental factor. So in this case, the environment is our macro environmental factor. And so in line with the United Nations SDGs, our Sustainable Development Goals, they wanted to ensure the products are made from renewable or recyclable materials. So this is sort of the United Nations kind of the goals themselves actually driving the change in a way, because they inspired Lego to make this change. And you can also say that it's intersecting with sociocultural, the expectations of society these days are impacting Lego's decision here more than likely, because they realize that they need to cater to those demands and those expectations. So it's now made from sustainable materials, and customers can easily recycle the materials as well. So now we're going to have a look at the drivers of change. These are really important for you to know, because the whole idea of business renewal, you need to understand what drives the business renewal. And the drivers of change will also come into some of those analytical tools that we will look at later on as well. Corporate culture is our first one, and that's all about the values and the beliefs embedded in a business, and that includes in the employees as well. And it distinguishes different companies from one another, because different companies are going to have different corporate cultures, different styles of the way that they work, and that is going to be that differentiating factor. Business leaders are responsible for building corporate culture, and they do that by implementing procedures, reward systems, and things like that are going to reflect the business's employees and its strategic plan. So it's about thinking about what kind of feel that they want to have in their organization, what their values are, and then making that become the culture of all of the employees and the business as a whole. And we have Microsoft as an example. Microsoft's corporate culture is said to be inclusive, innovative, diverse, and accountable. So diversity does come into this as well, because you've got that idea that you need to have workforce diversity in order to have that inclusion of different people, to not discriminate against people from different backgrounds or different belief systems. You want to foster that inclusiveness and that teamwork to to also reflect society as well and the way that society really is. And Microsoft rewards employees for ideas that contribute to the company's success. So it's not just money-making machine where no employees are really rewarded beyond their general pay packet for the ideas that they come up with. The company shows its appreciation for employees by having those reward systems. And Microsoft also has the best global corporate culture according to our website here comparably back in 2022. So you can see how implementing those practices like rewarding employees, showing that they're valued, training employees, having that diversity, showing accountability, so things like transparency and things like that, so there's trust in the organization. Those things are all going to factor into corporate culture. Management styles. An organization's management style is going to be sometimes a driving force of change because it's going to influence the business's outcomes in terms of those changes. So management is responsible for instigating the change, and they then have whatever management style they use to make that change happen is going to impact the way it all pans out. They have to motivate stakeholders. They need to communicate clearly. Again, that idea of transparency. And they need to manage the employees who are resistant to change. There's different ways of doing that we will look at later on, but they can have different positive and negative impacts on a business. And so the management style is going to be really important as to how the stakeholders respond and what kind of reputation as well you have in the public eye as well. So the four main management styles, we've got autocratic. Management is going to maintain full power over the change. It's not a collaborative kind of approach with the employees or with any other stakeholders. Persuasive is a little bit more flexible than that. Management is going to still have power over the change, but they're going to make an effort to persuade those workers to support the change as well. Consultative, we're getting more collaborative here, where management is going to confer with stakeholders, consult with them, and they're going to be somewhat engaged in that change. And then participative is the most involved for stakeholders, for employees and other parties. Management and employees are going to collectively make decisions about the change. So it's more of an equal kind of power balance there. And if we think of an example, we'll have a look at a few other examples, but something that might stand out from more recent times may be Twitter and the management style that Elon Musk used when making that transition in terms of his ownership of Twitter, and then also his transition more recently to the newer branding, so it's now X and things like that. So you had lots of employees who actually left the organization. Some of them chose to leave because they no longer felt that they belonged there. And also a lot of them were fired as well. So you've got that idea of management style that's perhaps autocratic. The employees didn't have any control over the way that he was changing the business. They felt powerless as a result, and then left because of that. So you can see how the different kind of management styles are going to have different impacts in that way. Participative is also great, except obviously it is challenging when you've got lots of different interests of different employees and managers, and balancing that can be tricky. So while that is a great method to make sure that you've got some stakeholder satisfaction with employees, it isn't necessarily straightforward. Some other examples of management styles. So McDonald's, you could argue, could also be autocratic. And while we haven't had a situation the same as Twitter, where you've got really highly publicized kind of, I guess, dissatisfaction, for McDonald's, it's probably that autocratic kind of style, because ultimately all the crew members aren't going to be involved in decision making. And that's more or less just because it's going to help McDonald's streamline their processes. If you think about how big the company is, it would be next to impossible to involve every single employee in that. You've got franchise owners, you've got all the teenagers who work part-time at McDonald's, and then all of the people higher up in the management system, for each different country that McDonald's operates in. So it's going to streamline their process and be a lot easier to make it autocratic. You could say perhaps that maybe it's also a little bit of a, we've got persuasive perhaps, but that maybe doesn't extend all the way down to the crew members right at the front counter serving the different food. And a consultative example, we've got Boost Juice. Boost Juice is going to have that consultative kind of style because the business asks for staff input, and managers encourage all staff members to contribute to team discussions at monthly team meetings. So having those meetings is allowing that dialogue to happen, allowing those different employees to have a say. And in terms of autocratic, again, oftentimes you'll see that big businesses are going to have autocratic styles because it's too hard to have a style that's involving the input of stakeholders. Organizational structures. And a great example that you can think of here to help you understand what this means is just thinking about the structure of your high school in terms of the different employees. So organizational structure is outlining the duties of employees and the management hierarchy within a business. Thinking about hierarchy is a good way of remembering this. And changes to a business's organizational structure may include changing the structure of employee positions, the chain of command, so who's in charge, or the management framework. And these changes may be necessary when a business expands internationally, downsizes, merges with another company, or acquires another company. So whether the change is involving growth or getting smaller, it is going to be relevant to as a driver of change, organizational structures. And in terms of school, so you start off with your principal at the top. You likely have some kind of deputy principals or something along those lines. You've got heads of departments, and then you've got teachers. And then even you can extend that further down below, and you can also think your principal has a boss as well. So it does actually extend beyond that too. Every organization is going to have some kind of hierarchy like this. Some examples. In April 2022, Toyota implemented changes to its executive structure, so its organizational structure. They reorganized their operating officer roles and established a new executive vice president position. So as we can see, there's a few ways that you can do it. You can be changing the chain of command. Some other role could become higher up than another one. New positions can be created. Positions that are already existing can be removed, and things like that. And also in 2022, Telstra announced that it moved all consumer and small business call centers to Australia. Previously, they had some of those call centers overseas with that offshoring kind of strategy. So to do this, with this change, they hired 2,000 more people who mostly work remotely. So that was a huge change to their organizational structure in terms of getting rid of that offshoring structure, adding in a whole lot more employees to their Australian kind of network, and then making them remote as well. So they don't need to be in person in the big kind of cities where they probably have their different headquarters. Competition is another huge driver of change, which we touched on when we looked at the operating macro and internal factors. So businesses have to monitor the strengths and weaknesses of their competitors, not just themselves. And they need to look at shifts in the business environment and evolving customer needs. And they need to do this so they can continually adapt to the competitive environment. Otherwise, they may not remain relevant and attractive to consumers. If things are changing, opinions are changing, other things are sort of trending in society, then not failing to monitor is going to result in the business falling behind. You can think of if you are on social media and you're not keeping up with the trends, then you're going to fall behind with understanding what's happening in that kind of landscape. And if you're some kind of influencer, then you're going to fall behind in terms of being relevant and attractive to your followers. So this kind of applies to more than just big business. It can apply to individuals as well. And competition can be a driver of change when those existing competitors change things like their pricing or their advertising strategy. Maybe they introduce new products. That could be through sort of innovation that they do, research and development that they do to find new products to create, and then using new technology as well. And then, of course, when a new competitor is going to enter the market, so some kind of competitor that wasn't already there, that's going to result in a big change in the competitive landscape for that business. So a number of years ago now, in the supermarket kind of space, you had I think it was a Dutch company that was going to come into Australia as a new supermarket chain, and that would have greatly impacted Woolworths, Coles, Aldi, etc. So that didn't end up occurring, but it would have been on the radar of those businesses because they would have had to have come up with strategies to make sure that they didn't greatly lose their existing market share. And some other examples, we've got KFC, and they recognized a drive-through only option was a bit of a trend in the competitive fast food industry. So back in 2019, they opened their first drive-through only store in Newcastle, and this involved using new technology. because, of course, without employees, you have to have the technology to make sure that it's operating effectively. And you can see a bit of a visual of what this was planned to look like as well. Another example you may be even more familiar with is the Woolworths and Coles rivalry when it comes to all their collectibles series. So back when this started, it was 2018. Coles was actually the first one to launch collectibles, and that was their little shop collection. And Woolworths actually suffered as a result of that in that quarter for their profits, and they realized that they needed to respond in order to, like we said, remain relevant, remain competitive, and appeal to clearly what the customers were showing that they wanted. So they then launched their own collectibles. You had things like the different Lion King ones and the Oshies and those sorts of ones that all came out as a result of that. And we continue to see collectibles series today as well. And just in terms of thinking about how that can intersect with other considerations, if you think of the environment, that was one of the big kind of controversies when it came to these collectibles because they are made of plastic. And some people weren't happy about the idea that they were producing all of these little collectibles that were going to just be contributing more to the environmental problem that we're facing. So that you can see how you can have different values among consumers, and that can result in different things in terms of competition and the way that you choose to strategically respond. Legislative compliance. So we've got lots of examples from the supermarkets. You can see that they are definitely relevant in terms of drivers of change. And so federal, state, or local legislative changes can make change necessary within a business, because ultimately, if you don't comply with the law, then you're going to have some kind of consequences. It could be a fine, it could be something more serious than that, some kind of ban of some sort. And the introduction of new laws can also compel businesses to alter their practices to ensure compliance. So it can be direct laws that a business just has to change, and it can be the business making decisions, I guess, ahead of those laws. So if things are changing in the legal kind of environment, the business might make a change before the new laws actually come into place. Obviously, you want to make those changes before laws come into place, otherwise you'll get in trouble, but well before the laws come into place is what I'm getting at there, recognizing perhaps what will happen in future in terms of future laws and that kind of thing. We've got plastic bag laws as an example. Again, in 2018, retailers had to stop supplying customers with the single-use plastic bags we used to see all the time, and they had to change their practices as a result of those laws, and they would face fines if they didn't comply, or as well if they gave some misleading information about plastic bags, then that would also result in some kind of consequences too. Some more examples: minimum wage laws. So these change quite often. They've changed more recently, and then also in July 2022, the national minimum wage increased by 5%. and businesses had to adjust as a result of that. That was driving change within lots of different businesses, and it could have driven change beyond just how much businesses were paying their employees. So some businesses may have actually been forced to change staff members with the number of staff that they employ because of not being able to compensate them according to those new requirements. And then tobacco advertising laws with cigarettes. So Australia has laws around advertising and packaging of tobacco products, and that is the idea behind that is making sure that people aren't smoking, and tobacco businesses can't use logos, brand images, or promotional text on their packaging, and instead the packaging has to display those health warnings like we can see on this example packet here, with the unpleasant kind of picture, the idea of mouth cancer and throat cancer as well, and you can see the warning in yellow on the side there as well. Force field analysis. We'll be going through this in more depth when we look at our analytical tools and models later on, but as a brief overview here, this was created by Kurt Lewin, and it's used to identify and examine the driving forces and restraining forces for the implementation of a suggested change. So we've had a look just now at all of the different driving forces, legislative compliance, the corporate culture, organizational structure, things like that. So driving forces are the factors that are prompting or supporting a change occurring. So they're all either going to make it happen, make it necessary, or they're just going to be a supporter as that change happens. And restraining forces are just the opposite. They're restraining, they're holding back that change from occurring. So factors that obstruct change. To conduct a force field analysis, you've got 3 key steps. The first one is just identifying what those driving and restraining forces are. The second one is assigning a score to represent each force's level of influence. 1 is the least influential and 5 is the most influential. And the last step is to tally the scores to determine whether the driving or restraining forces are stronger. So of course, since 1 is the least and 5 is the most in that scoring kind of system, the stronger of the two, driving or restraining, will have that higher tally. Based on the information gained from doing this comparison, a strategy can be developed to implement the change. So that could involve either strengthening the driving forces or weakening the restraining forces, depending on what has found to be the most important from that analysis. And it could also be determined that the change is not feasible at all and should not be implemented. So perhaps the restraining forces are significantly stronger than driving forces, and the business might identify that it's not really possible to weaken the restraining forces or strengthen the driving forces enough in order to make it actually a viable option. Performance management. So performance management is a process in which management reviews the overall performance of a business and its employees specifically as well to determine how goals can be better reached. And performance management can help to identify strategies to enhance the performance of employees, and it can also improve the overall productivity through reviewing the business processes and changing those if necessary. Our example here is Google. So Google introduced a new rating system for employees and streamlined its evaluation processes in 2022. Performance ratings now happen once per year, and promotions happen twice per year. So you've got that idea of looking at how employees are performing, that idea of checking with those performance ratings, and then also having that rewards system as well with promotions. So it's about looking at ways to enhance the performance of employees, and promotions can be that motivational kind of strategy to make that happen. And if they're more motivated, then that can have that flow on effect again of increasing productivity. So keep in mind that performance management is a continuous cycle. It has 4 stages. We start off with setting objectives. What are the goals? Then we've got measuring performance. Providing feedback is step 3, and identifying the needs and requirements is that last step. And it's going to continue around in that cycle kind of format. You need to be able to identify the needs, and once you've done that, you'll be back to continuously looking at measuring performance, looking at feedback. You don't just want to measure performance once and then leave it at that, because then you're going to lose that momentum that you may have had. If employees aren't being checked up on, then maybe they'll lose their motivation to continue to be as productive as they can be. You need to also provide feedback all the time to employees to make sure that they understand what they're doing well, understand how they could improve, and that kind of thing. Another example we have here is Amazon. So Amazon has controversial performance management systems for staff. They are said to have rubrics to determine how well employees fulfill their roles and how much potential they have compared to other employees. So when you think about Amazon's business model, it is heavily based on people getting their packages really quickly. And as a result of that, you do have lots of pressure on employees to make that happen. And so Amazon has those different things in place that check the performance of employees, and in some ways perhaps make them feel pressured as a result, because they could lose their job if they're not performing as well as others in the organization. And performance management can result in several outcomes during business transformation. I mentioned there how you could lose your job. So redundancy is one. That's not the same as just being fired, though. It's about when an employee's position isn't actually needed anymore and they're let go of as a result. So the employee would have to pay them, but the employer would have to pay them to compensate for the job loss. And the amount of money that that employee is entitled to is dependent on a few things. It's dependent on their experience and how long they've worked in the organization. And oftentimes it's easier to make redundant someone who has less experience and less time in the organization, because they will be entitled to less money, and that is better for the business than needing to have big payouts for experienced staff members. Retraining is another potential outcome. And so this is just when employees are taught more about the activities they have to perform as part of their role. You would get training as part of your induction at the start of your role, But then things change in society at large, and then also just the organization specifically. So you need to continue to respond to that and adapt to that by training and retraining employees so they're up to date all the time. Thinking just about a classic kind of example of COVID-19, which would have affected lots of businesses when it came to retraining. They would have had to have had lots of retraining of employees so they were aware of the different requirements around, for example, if you think about the food industry, food safety and that kind of thing. And on that note, with COVID-19, that also resulted in lots of redundancies as well. An example that comes to mind for me there is the NRL, which had to make redundant a lot of employees because they ultimately weren't making the revenue they were previously because of COVID, and they could no longer sustain all of those employees that, for example, would go out to schools and do workshops with students because those things weren't happening anymore at that time. Now, development is different to retraining, so keep that in mind. Each employee is going to establish a plan with their employer that allows them to develop in their career. And it's going to also improve their ability to perform their role in the business. So retraining is about usually more broad than just one employee. It's going to be about those skills and learning how to do those activities as part of their position. Development is more of a one-on-one thing with the employer. It's about the individual employee having that plan so they can develop in their career. Okay, we're up to strategies for overcoming resistance to change. I mentioned earlier how there are some different strategies for this, and when we were talking about the management styles, and you can see that we've labeled these ones as either low risk or high risk, depending on the amount of risk the business would be taking on by using the strategy. Our first one is communication, and that is definitely a low risk strategy for overcoming resistance to change because it's a key part of any business anyway. It's about honest, effective communication throughout that transformation, renewal kind of phase. And that's going to ensure that stakeholders are supportive of the change and they're dedicated to making the change happen successfully. And you can have lots of different communication mediums. You can be communicating in-person conversations, formal and informal meetings, reports, emails, all sorts of different communication styles can be part of this strategy. And this diagram that we have here is illustrating a communication continuum. And so a business could follow this to overcome resistance to change. You make employees aware of why the change is necessary, what's sort of happening in the business environment, and then that's going to lead to them understanding that need. And with understanding comes that idea of alignment. So they're going to align themselves with that understanding, with that way of thinking, and they'll be then on board with that, and that'll lead to that acceptance idea. Once you've accepted the need for the change, understand how the change needs to happen and why, you'll then have that commitment to the change and commitment to being part of making it happen. So communication should ultimately occur regardless for any kind of change, because if you think about not having communication when a change is happening, then you're definitely going to have very poor stakeholder satisfaction because employees are going to feel in the dark. You're not going to have good transparency, and they're not going to feel like you value them enough to involve them in the decision making. Another low risk strategy for overcoming resistance is participation. And so this is more of that active kind of involvement. We saw earlier that the participative management style was the most collaborative kind of style that there was. And so participation is about encouraging that staff engagement in the change process, and that's going to make employees feel like they have a sense of control and they have a say, they have a voice, and that will work towards enhancing the business's corporate culture. If employees feel like they're being ignored or they're not valued, then that is not going to lead to a very pleasant environment within that business. So that's why participation is really a strong strategy. And involving employees can act as well as that motivational tool, because when they feel listened to and appreciated, they are likely going to enjoy coming to work more. They're going to be more enthusiastic and more inclined to share their ideas and be involved in the business's success. And so participation is a low risk strategy. So you may think that every business should use this. It sounds great, but that doesn't mean that it's easy as well. Definitely when you have a big business too, it can be really tricky to have that staff engagement with every staff member. And if you're only engaging with some staff members and not others, then that can lead to further problems in terms of that sort of imbalance, that unfairness. So keep in mind that while there are lots of benefits, it doesn't mean that it's an easy strategy to pull off. Negotiation is another low risk strategy for overcoming resistance, and it's often required when the change occurs. You can use that participation and that communication in the lead up, but when the change is occurring, you need to negotiate on the fly sometimes with the people involved to get them on board. And so employers or leaders in an organization may identify those employees who are likely to resist change and negotiate with them to gain their cooperation and their support. So if you're not familiar with negotiation, it's that bargaining kind of process. If you think about when you're negotiating with your parent as a child about how much money you're going to get to be able to spend at the theme park or something like that, you may say $10 and your parents might say $5, and then you may say $7. And so that kind of bargaining process where you're trying to reach that kind of happy medium in a way. And it's about avoiding arguments because both parties are communicating respectfully, and it's finding that compromise, that idea of that happy medium somewhere in the middle of what each party originally wanted. Now, it can be a straightforward strategy to avoid significant kind of resistance, but it can also be expensive in a couple of different ways. It can be expensive in a monetary sense if you've had to use sort of monetary incentives in order to get your employees on board, or it could be expensive in other ways as well. If you've had to negotiate something that you originally wanted to do and that had to change a little bit, then maybe it's not going to be exactly the way that the leaders of the organization originally envisaged, and that could be expensive, so to speak. Manipulation. This is where we get to our high risk strategy for overcoming resistance. And when you think of manipulation in everyday kind of language, this is the exact same thing. And so you're aiming to achieve the result that you want, so overcoming that resistance by strategically dealing with or exercising your influence and power over an employee. So you can be, using your language, using your words to be sort of really persuasive in that clever kind of way. But it can cause more damage as well to the business's corporate culture. While it can be quick, it can be damaging, because if the employees recognize that they're being manipulated, then they probably aren't going to appreciate that. And that can again lead to actually worsening the problem as well. That's why we've got this idea of high risk here. There's more chance that it could go wrong. And it can also be expensive too, just like negotiation can be expensive. This one is potentially expensive depending on the incentives that leaders may use to manipulate the employees. So to paint a picture for us, some examples of manipulation. You could offer an incentive to a change-resistant staff member, such as a promotion or a reward or something to gain their support. Or you could communicate the advantages of a change, but not mention the disadvantages. So almost lying by omission in a way to manipulate employees by making them see the good but not the bad. And our second and last high risk strategy for overcoming resistance is threat. Now, manipulation you can think of as being more subtle. Not everyone perhaps will recognize when they're being manipulated. When it comes to threat, it's probably more obvious, and it's going to involve intimidating employees with some kind of punishment if they don't come on board with the change. So you could be threatening them with the demotion or a dismissal entirely. They could be losing their job if they don't get on board with the change. And that's going to force employees to accept the change if they want to avoid those consequences. So that fear factor of making the employee worried about what is at stake, what they could lose, or what they could suffer from if they don't come on board with the change. Threat can be quick and simple, but it can also cause increased resistance and complaints and resentment among employees, and again, therefore, can harm corporate culture. So, even more so, perhaps, than manipulation, employees are probably going to recognize more clearly when they're being threatened with something, and you've got an even higher chance, therefore, that they will be resenting your decision to treat them in that way, and that can therefore result in complaints, for sort of unfair kind of treatment or unfair dismissal, things like that. And it can result in increased resistance. They can rally against you and want to sort of stand up for what they believe in by going against the change. And they can potentially then persuade other employees who were supportive of the change originally or maybe were more on the fence. They could convince those people to come onto their side instead. And that, of course, can just cause even more problems for you as the business leader. So again, you can see how this one is definitely higher risk than those other strategies like participation and communication. Okay, now we're on to the role of consultants and professional services. A consultant is an external professional hired by a business to offer advice on particular issues that are affecting the business and then analyze the business's efficiency and its effectiveness. And so a consultant could help a post-mature business, which is what we're looking at. Remember, this is the post-maturity stage, and it's about renewal and being in that final stage of the business life cycle. So strategies to minimize expenses, they could help with providing ideas around that. Strategies to regain market share, and then expansion opportunities as well. Some businesses in the post-maturity stage can have that renewal and then actually continue to grow. Other businesses may need to shut down, or they may need to find ways to minimize expenses to ensure that they don't have to leave the market entirely. And post-mature businesses may have lost some market share after falling into post-maturity, and they may want to regain that with the help of a consultant who's that professional in that field. On the other hand, you've got professional services, and these people are also specialists in their field, but they're offering external expertise to businesses. So they're different to consultants because they are accountable for their work-related activities because of the nature of the knowledge they provide. So when you have a consultation, you're getting the advice from that person, but if the advice doesn't work out, then they're not liable for that. It's your sort of choice to trust them with their thoughts on an issue. Whereas professional services, you can think of that idea of professional, they have that liability. So things like roles like accountants, lawyers, solicitors, doctors, engineers, and architects, you can have really serious financial and health and legal kind of implications if you don't get the right advice from these kind of professional service providers. So that's why they are accountable for what they tell you. Strategic planning and vision for change management. A vision for change is the position that a business hopes to be in after a change has been introduced. So vision is all about how you see something in the future. So a vision for change is, what will that change look like after it's happened? And what will the business look like after the change has happened? And this vision for change is going to communicate why the change should occur and what the change will result in. You've got that idea of supporting the change with some kind of proof, some kind of reasoning, and then showing what the benefits will be, what it will look like. A strategic plan is a strategy developed by a business that's going to detail how the change will actually be executed. So the vision is what it will look like and why it needs to happen, and the plan is how are we going to make it happen. And strategic planning occurs after the vision for change has been formed. Of course, you need to know what you are hoping to achieve before you can create your plan to make that a reality. So the relationship is that completing these two steps leads to the change, and the change that you envisaged from the start. So we can see in this diagram here, vision for change plus strategic planning equals the change. And underneath vision for change, we've got why is it necessary and what position does the business hope to be in. Strategic planning, how will it be executed? What strategies will be used? Those two things go hand in hand to make the change a success. Okay, we're now on to looking at some models of change management. And these are going to be really important for your external exam. Not only do you need to understand these from that kind of explaining perspective, be able to explain the sort of concept behind these and how they work, but then also applying them as well to actual business kind of situations too. So Lewin's change model has 3 steps. We've got unfreeze, change, and refreeze. We can see that in that diagram there as well. So try and remember this by thinking that in order to make the change, the business has to melt down its existing practices, unfreeze before it can change, because you can't change that frozen kind of frozen business. Once you've unfrozen that, you can then conduct the change when you've got all those pieces that you can move around and reshuffle, and then once you've made those changes, you refreeze to form that solidified change and back to that original kind of state. So if we look at that in more detail, unfreeze is about preparing for and managing the change. And that's going to ensure that stakeholders understand why the change is necessary. If we think again back to what we've just gone through, this is going to involve overcoming some resistance to change potentially as well, because some stakeholders won't be on board with it. Excuse me. So yeah, in order to make stakeholders understand, you will need communication, you may need participation or negotiation, and we also looked at threat and manipulation, which hopefully you can avoid. And then the change occurring, so that's when you've got the implementation of the change, and you're still going to have ongoing communication, because you don't just let people know that this is happening and then leave it at that. You need to provide updates on how it's going, what the progress is, if any alterations to the initial plan are being made, and why, if that's the case as well. And then refreeze, that's where you're solidifying, sustaining, and celebrating the change. So making sure it's all in place again, making sure it's maintained, and then celebrating it as well, because you want to have that sense of regained stability in the business, so employees feel like it was a success. It's important for them to recognize it as a success so they can have trust in management, particularly if they were resistant to begin with. Then showing that it actually was successful is perhaps going to mean that in future they will have less resistance to begin with and greater trust in the management to make decisions that are right for the business and its employees. So also celebrating as well is just a good part of corporate culture as well. You want employees to feel valued. They probably had a role in that change being executed successfully. So showing appreciation for them is also a way to make your corporate culture strong, leading to motivation, leading to productivity, leading to the strongest business possible. Lots of flow on effects. Something that might be a little bit trickier for you to remember is Kotter's theory, so his 8-step model of change. This model helps businesses to execute change successfully by providing that framework for the implementation of a change. And it's about making sure that employees are participating in the change and accepting the change. You can see that we've got 3 overarching phases and then some steps, either 2 or 3 steps in each stage. So phase 1, is create the climate for change. This has parallels with Kurt Lewin's model that we just had a look at, where you're preparing for it, you're unfreezing the organization to make that change, get that in the works, I suppose. So first of all, we're creating that sense of urgency. This is about persuading stakeholders that the change needs to happen and it needs to happen now. Then you're forming a powerful coalition. So by this, we just mean a team, an authoritative team that's going to be able to implement that change. You've created that sense of urgency that it needs to happen. Then you're forming the team to be those people who are going to bring it into fruition. And then you're creating a vision for change, which we looked at before, where you're looking at those strategies and what it will actually look like once the change has occurred. Our second phase is engaging and enabling the organization. You want to, after you've created the vision, you want to communicate. So this is about engaging the organization and the people within it. You need to ensure that all stakeholders are notified of the change. So they would have already been aware of it because you had that sense of urgency that you would have created at the start. And you need to make sure that you're making stakeholders aware of the change before you get to this second phase. Otherwise, you would be springing it on them too much. So ensuring that stakeholders are notified, and if any changes have been made from what was originally proposed in step 1, then you would be outlining that here as well. Step 5, empower action. Remove obstacles and empower others to follow the vision. If you do have resistance to change, then that's coming into play here with the business needing to try and remove those obstacles like that resistance to change. And then creating quick wins. Acknowledge and reward the people involved in the change. And again, this factors into motivation, to corporate culture, feeling valued and celebrated. So showing the people involved that their contribution is valued. Then the last phase is implementing the change. So you want to build on the change in step 7 consolidate the change, and pursue sustained improvement. You need to maintain what you've been able to deliver and then hopefully continue to build on that as well. And then lastly, you want to make it stick. Ensure that stakeholders are aware of the success of the change. Again, we looked in that previous model for the force, Kurt Lewin's three-step model of change. The third step involved celebrating the change. So make it stick is similar to that, where you need to make sure that people are aware of how successful it's been. That will build that trust, hopefully lead to less resistance in future, and those people involved will feel valued too. And as I mentioned, that one is obviously involving 8 steps. It's a little bit more tricky to remember than our unfreeze, change, refreeze model. So you may want to come up with some kind of memorization strategy to help you with this. To remember the steps, you can have some kind of acronym, and you could have a rhyme or a song or something like that as well, depending on what suits you and what you can come up with that's related to this theory. We've got an example here of an acronym. And so our acronym is Customers Forming Close Connections Excites Clever Business Managers. And those letters that those words all start with then are the same word that coincides with the idea behind the steps. Customers is starting with a C, and then we've got create starting with a C, a sense of urgency. Then we've got forming a powerful coalition, creating a vision for change, communicating the vision, empowering action, creating quick wins, building on the change, and making it stick. And if you wanted to, you could also shorten these. If all you need to know as a spark for your memory is just the word urgency, then maybe urgency is all you need to know for step 1. Maybe coalition is all you need to know for step 2. That kind of thing. So it depends on how detailed you need this to be as to how you may design it to work for you. Okay, now that we've done our models, we're on to our analytical tools. And so in terms of the syllabus requirements, when it comes to analytical tools, you have to select data and information relating to the stakeholders of a business in the post-maturity stage to analyze power interest, and a business that has undertaken change management and analyze the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. A business in the post-maturity stage to analyze pressures for or against change. You can see how each of these corresponds to those different analysis tools, which we'll go through next. So it's all relating to businesses in the post-maturity stage. First one, you're looking at the power interests of stakeholders. The second one, it's the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats involved in the change management. And then pressures for or against change for a post-mature business is the force field analysis. And then looking at drivers of change to analyze the business situation using a SWOT analysis. Remembering those drivers of change are things like legislative compliance, corporate culture, organizational structure, things like that. Once you've selected that data and information relating to that post-mature business, you then need to look at interpreting relationships, patterns, and trends. So the power interest grid, you're going to draw conclusions about the implications of transformation. So in terms of people with different levels of power and different levels of interest, what kind of conclusions can you draw about the impact of transformation on those things? You'll be looking at the SWOT analysis to draw conclusions about the implications of change management on our 4 key pillars: financial, human resources, marketing, and operations. And then lastly, the force field analysis to draw conclusions about, again, the implications of transformation. Now, keep in mind, this may feel like a lot of stuff, but you won't be doing all of these things. So in your external exam, you're not going to have to do a power interest grid and a force field analysis and a SWOT analysis. So for your business report extract section, if you have that kind of question where you have to do a more detailed look at some stimulus and a business situation, you will get either the power interest grid or the force field analysis that you have to use, not both. So keep that in mind. However, you do need to be across both of them because you don't ultimately know what will be on the exam. So let's have a look at each of these types. So we've got force field analysis to begin with. Lewin's force field analysis is a common change management approach, and it's used by businesses to implement change. And so according to this force field analysis concept, situations are maintained by an equilibrium between driving and restraining forces. So equilibrium in this case is about that balance. It means that you've got both driving and restraining forces on either side. Driving forces have to be strengthened or restraining forces have to be weakened for the situation to shift and the change to occur. And this change management technique is going to maximize the likelihood that the change will be successful because it helps businesses to identify any obstacles that are in the way and overcome them. So you can see an example here that we've got for Avon. You've got driving forces, what is making the change, what's supporting the change, and then restraining forces, what is preventing that change. So if we look at this in more depth, we can see that the driving forces in this case are outweighing the restraining forces. And so you have your change in the middle, what is going to happen. In this case, we've got Avon changing their business model by discontinuing door-to-door sales in favor of online sales methods. So Avon back in the day was very well known for door knocking. Different sales representatives would come around to your house and sell you the different cosmetics products. And of course, that is not so relevant in today's day and age because we tend to buy online. We tend not to be home during the day kind of period anymore because we have more gender equality. Women are working these days rather than being at home in that kind of housewife role. So we can see why this change would be necessary, but at the same time, there are some restraining forces. If we have a look at some of the examples of that, so driving forces, we've got reduced expenses because of the lack of those sales representatives that you would no longer need. The competitive idea, so that's we saw that earlier, that driving force of change can be the competition. consumer demand for e-commerce and convenience, that idea of people and technology coming together to influence that need for change, and that idea that women are not at home as much anymore. It's more common for women to be able to have that job now where they're not at home. And so those are all our driving forces. And you can think of lots of these as well. This is just a bit of an excerpt. Restraining forces, the cost of implementing new technologies. You, of course, need to have a system for online purchases. Loss of point of difference. So it would mean Avon was blending in with other organizations. And then sales representatives would be redundant. So you've potentially got a corporate culture issue there, needing to let go of a whole lot of valued employees. And then loss of relationships between Avon and customers. So a big strength of that strategy was that they did have that one-on-one kind of rapport between sales representatives and the customers, and that would be lost by going to online sales methods. And so we can see that we've done our scoring as well. And keep in mind when it comes to this scoring that there's no right or wrong necessarily. So there is, you've got to definitely be logical. I mean, there's some things that you would absolutely not give a 5 or a 1. So for example, in this, the idea of remaining competitive by having an online presence, we've given that a 5 here to show how important it is. It would be okay to give it a 4 here, but for example, giving that a 1, you really couldn't justify that because competition and what others are doing in the industry is a really, really big factor in the need for this change. So don't stress too much over the nitty-gritty numbers. Should it be 4? Should it be 5? Should it be 1? Should it be 2? But just be logical and think about, can I justify the number that I've given this driving or restraining force? Now, based on this analysis that we've done for Avon, they would be able to formulate strategies to ensure that they successfully change the business model, because you do have that backing. Those driving forces are strong enough there. They could try to weaken restraining forces, for example, by developing a new point of difference and offering sales representatives positions elsewhere in the business as well. So you already have that, those driving forces in this case are already outweighing the restraining forces, but that doesn't mean that you can just rest on your laurels. You still want to make sure that you're addressing potential problems, and that means addressing those restraining forces that have been identified too. A power interest grid, and this is a tool used to analyze the power and the interests of stakeholders in a project or some kind of issue. So measuring stakeholders' power and interest gives the individual or team who is leading the project insight into the level of engagement and communication that each stakeholder needs. If they've got really high power and really high interest, then they're going to need more engagement and more communication, more sort of hand-holding than they would need if they really aren't interested at all and have no power anyway. So conducting a power interest grid is about plotting stakeholders on a graph. So our y-axis, which is vertical, up and down, is representing the level of power, and the x-axis, horizontal, is representing the level of interest. And the graph is divided into 4 sections, and each of these is going to represent that different degree of power and interest. So our 4 sections, we've got monitor. This is low power and low interest, and it would be in the bottom left-hand corner of the graph. Keep informed, low power and high interest. Keep satisfied is when you've got high power but low interest. So they need to be happy with what's happening, but they don't really care a great deal. You need to keep them happy because of the power that they have. You need to keep low power and low interest stakeholders informed because they're interested, they want to know about it, but they don't need to necessarily be satisfied because ultimately they don't have any say really anyway. And then manage closely, of course, is when you've got high power and high interest, and that is the top right-hand corner of the graph. So let's have a look at an example. General Motors, the automotive company, wants to only manufacture electric cars by 2035 and become carbon neutral by 2040. So they need to determine the power and interest of stakeholders to engage with them through this project. So step 1, you need to identify the stakeholders. So it's going to be people who are internal and external to the organization. Everything from your CEO to your head of sustainability to general employees, and then other organizations and other individuals. So not only consumers who would be buying these cars that would be electric, but also environmental activists, the electric vehicle charging stations. So they would benefit from this change because you would have more cars that rely on those charging stations. Fuel stations, which would suffer financially as a result because of less demand for their services. And then the Environmental Defense Fund in this case as well. So you can think of government organizations, non-government organizations, charities, all sorts of different organizations that will be involved. So here we can see how we've plotted these stakeholders, and it can be handy to use acronyms if there are acronyms, because otherwise, if you do have lots of stakeholders, it can get a little bit messy. But make sure if you're using acronyms that it's very clear what the acronym means. We have said that the CEO and the head of sustainability are both highly interested and highly powerful. You've got, for example, activists are very interested, but they don't have as much power as those internal people. You've got fuel companies that are very interested, but again, they really don't have much power over what happens. Employees are down in that monitor category, so they will be somewhat interested and they have a little bit of power, but ultimately they're not going to have too much interest or too much power to need to keep them too involved. Of course, you still need to communicate with employees, as we've seen throughout this session. In order to get employees on board, you need to manage resistance to change and things like that. But this is the same idea as what we looked at before with the force field analysis, where there's no distinct right or wrong. So I could put the employees over a centimeter to the left and a centimeter up, and ultimately it wouldn't make a great deal of difference. You, again, just need to be able to justify what you decide. In this case, you wouldn't be able to justify putting the CEO right down in the low category with no power and no interest, because logically they do have power as the chief executive of the company, and they do have interest because they, of course, are sort of responsible for making it work, making the organization financially viable and things like that. So this second idea is plotting those stakeholders where you can logically see them fit. Your SWOT analysis, which hopefully you are quite familiar with by now, it's about the internal strengths and weaknesses inside the organization. What is done well? What advantages does it potentially have over other organizations? And then what does it lack or do poorly? And what disadvantages does it have compared to others? Then you're looking at the opportunities and threats that are external to the organization. So in terms of threats, this is typically about competitors, but it can also be about just the general business environment, changes in the business environment, changes in society, the economy, technology. All of those can influence the business and potentially threaten the way that it does things. Opportunities. So you could think about, are there expansion opportunities? Can the business invest in new technologies? Is there an increasing demand for products or services that the business can leverage so they can get even more sales and more revenue? So that's a matter of looking at the business environment and thinking about what the business can do to make the best use of that. Okay, now we're on to our evaluation criteria. So in your external exam, you'll need to evaluate business strategies to make a decision and propose a recommendation. And to do this, you have to use your evaluation criteria. The 4 of these are competitiveness, stakeholder satisfaction, effectiveness, and efficiency. And there are a few things in the syllabus that you may need to evaluate. Financial management strategies for transforming a business, human resources management strategies, marketing strategies, and operations management strategies. So what I mentioned before, those 4 key pillars that you could be given. So it could be about internal, those employees. It could be about the way the business does its marketing. So if we look back and think about the example I mentioned earlier, Twitter or X, whatever you call it these days, you've got human resources management strategies that you could be analyzing in terms of how staff members were treated, and how the changes were managed in terms of redundancies, firing, employees choosing to resign as well. You could be looking at marketing strategies for them changing the name and the branding to X instead of Twitter. You could look at financial management strategies with that transition of ownership and how the business has managed its finances relating to that transformation. I would imagine it's suffered a little bit as a result because lots of people have left Twitter. And then just operations management strategies as well. So that's pretty directly related to human resources because the way that the business operates is directly tied to the way that the people are managed as well. So let's have a look at each of these 4 criteria in more depth. Competitiveness, you have some really good outlines in the syllabus giving you some definitions of various terms, and it does define these evaluation criteria too. So to what degree has the business offered products or services that meet or exceed market standards in relation to other businesses? So you've got that comparative element. You're looking at the business in comparison to others. So you can be comparing it to rival companies in the industry. So of course, it's got to be a relevant, an actual competitor that you're comparing the business to, not not a business from a different industry entirely. And there are a number of ways that you can think about and measure competitiveness. It could be profit related, which is probably the most obvious, but also things like market share, growth, or even decline as well, resources, intentions to expand, strategies employed by the business to drive competitiveness. So all of those things that could show how it's performing in relation to other businesses. Stakeholder satisfaction. To what degree has the business considered and managed stakeholder expectations in achieving goals or objectives? And you can think of lots of different stakeholders here. It's not just, we've spoken a lot today about employees and managing resistance to change and things like that, but it's a lot broader than that when it comes to stakeholder satisfaction. It's about the internal employees, management, and then also the investors and suppliers, and then, of course, customers as well. And then even just the more broader kind of public too. And it can be measured according to factors like the customer base growth or decline as well, employee retention rates, and continued loyalty and funding from investors. So if employees are sticking around, then that's likely because they are happy with the organization, they're getting the training, and they have a voice, and all of those things that we've mentioned today. If you're growing your customer base, then that probably means you've had some word of mouth kind of traction. You've got people people speaking positively about the business and driving more customers to use your services or buy your products. And then, of course, loyalty and funding from investors is always going to indicate that they are getting good returns, that they are happy with the level of transparency and things like that in the organization. Effectiveness and efficiency are the last two. So there's a way that we can try to remember the difference. Of course, they both are sort of similar words, so it can be a little bit confusing. Effectiveness is to what degree has the business achieved goals or objectives, and to what extent has the business solved targeted problems. So it relates to this idea of goals, and it can be applied to any business strategy. If it's effective, then they will have achieved the goals and overcome any barriers in the process of that. It's about doing the right thing, choosing the right thing to do and doing that. On the other hand, efficiency is doing it in the right way. So doing things right. To what degree has the business optimized its use of resources and application of processes in achieving those goals and objectives? So it's indicated by the amount of time and effort it requires to meet those objectives. And if it takes a really long time, then that's not efficient, right? So if you take a really long time to do your assignment, then that would mean that you're not as efficient as you could be in doing that. Okay, now we're up to some practice questions. So identify 2 different management styles and explain how each style can act as an internal driver of change. We can think back to our management styles. We had participative, autocratic, consultative, those sorts of ones. So you need to, this is an example of how you need to know you need to be able to explain things and just remember the different ideas, be able to list off the different management styles and know what each involves. So you can then choose 2 and then explain how they can act as a driver of change. So you could be thinking about that participative style and thinking about how that can act as a driver of change because you're involving all of the stakeholders, all of the employees, and they are then feeling valued, motivated, more productive. They are supportive of the change, and that's going to mean that it's going to drive change more easily because you're not going to have as much resistance by involving them from the outset. Second one, we've got using an example, describe one operating environmental factor that could influence a business manager to initiate change. And again, this is where you really need to know those 3 levels: internal, operating, and macro. Think about it like the building idea. Operating is the suppliers, customers, competitors, and interest groups. So you could talk here about, for example, competitors, and they could influence a manager to initiate change because they've introduced these innovative new products, and you need to make sure that you're keeping up with them to retain your market share and not lose out on profits. And keep in mind there as well that it does say using an example. So a big tip that I would give is make sure you not only know the content, like the theoretical stuff, but also think about the practical application of things. Think about what businesses you can actually use as an example to illustrate your understanding of the concept and of just the broader kind of business world that we live in. And you could, for example, use the example that I gave about Woolworths and Coles with the little shop collectibles versus the Oshies and the Lion King idea. Explain 2 circumstances using, again, examples in which legislative compliance would drive change for a business in the post-maturity stage. Again, you need those examples. So wage law changes, plastic bag changes, advertising rules around tobacco and things like that. Those are the sorts of examples that you can provide, and you would need to then explain how they have impacted those businesses in terms of driving change. Last one, explain 3 activities in the management of this business. So keep in mind that your external exam is going to have made up businesses. Throughout your studies so far in business, you would have been using real life businesses throughout, but when it comes to the external exam, it's made up businesses because that's sort of evening that playing field a bit. If some students would know a lot about an organization because they've heard of it, maybe they buy from it, things like that, that could unfairly sort of disadvantage those students who don't know about the organization. So this is that idea of fairness with these made up organizations. So you'll be given stimulus for ones like this. How could this what activities could this business undertake during the refreeze stage of Lewin's model of change management, and provide an example for each activity from the case study that you would have been given. Now, these are from the QCEE website with the sample external exams from previous years. So if you want to have a look at the stimulus and understand these questions in more depth, I would encourage you to have a look. And regardless, I would just encourage you to have a look anyway, because it's really helpful to see what to expect and have a go as well at doing practice questions. So here you can clearly see how you need to know the stages of the models that we went through and what actual activities could be in that stage. So you're thinking about solidifying the change, celebrating the change, sustaining the change, but then what activities could it actually undertake to achieve that as well? Think about the practical application of things as well. Using case study 1 to explain 2 objectives that could be included in a strategic plan to realize the owner's vision for change. And so all of these different aspects that we've covered today are really coming into these different questions. So understanding everything is important. Analyze the power interests of stakeholders and evaluate the proposed switch to a different type of operations. And we saw how we had those 4 pillars: marketing, operations, HR, and finance. So this one's an operations related question. And it's more subtle, so that you're not going to be told, like you may have been previously, use this tool, not outright like that. So the wording will be something more like this, where it says, analyze the power interests of stakeholders, and you need to recognize with that wording that it's talking about the power interest grid. Using case study 1, identify and explain one circumstance in which a consultant or a professional service could assist the business. And then analyze 2 forces for and 2 against change. And so again, thinking about driving and restraining forces, all of these different concepts are intersecting with one another as well. You've got things that are combining together. So you need to understand multiple things for multiple questions. And then the last one, using a SWOT analysis. You're interpreting trends and writing that business report kind of extract with looking at marketing strategies in this one and proposing some recommendations. So some tips to finish off. Make sure you know those real world examples to demonstrate the concepts and not just the definitions. You, of course, need to know how to describe and explain things, but ultimately using those real world examples is part of explaining. Explaining is going into more depth than describing, and using examples is a great way of achieving that. Use the syllabus as a study guide. All of the things that we've covered today are from the syllabus. It shows you exactly what you do need to be able to describe, explain, analyze, evaluate, etc. So scan the top QR code on this page to access the syllabus, or just visit the QCEE website and find business. If you finish your exam early, use the extra time wisely. So reread as much of your exam as you can. You want to be looking for grammatical errors. You want to be looking for ways that you could improve your terminology. You want to be making sure that you've gone into enough depth and you've answered the question directly and all of those sorts of things that it can be easy to miss when you're in a hurry. And as I mentioned just there, using business terminology. So creating a word bank can be handy as well to help you remember those important business terms, and the syllabus can help you create that too. You've got a glossary in the syllabus and all of the outline of what you need to know for the exam is going to use all the terminology that we've spoken about today. And it's not just the concepts that you need to be able to name. So you need to be able to say legislative compliance, organizational structure, things like that. But also, for example, trying to be sophisticated. Don't say money all the time. Say capital, things like that. Little nuances like that can make a difference in how you perform. And then access the external exams on the QCEE website. The 2022 version will be there as well. And you may want to print them out and try and do them in those exam conditions to replicate what it would be like on the day. And you can scan that bottom QR code to access some of those exams as well. Definitely make use of the QCEE website and any textbooks that you have, any class notes that you have. They are really invaluable to making sure that you do the best you can for this external exam. Thank you everyone for watching, and good luck with your business external exam and the rest of your studies as well. Thank you.